DVDs?
So, I'm Steve Daly, Head of Technology at BBC Archives, as was just said there, and we secure the past for the future. We look after everything that the BBC would like to keep forever. And that's across our wide-ranging physical and digital collections. So, for example, we have all the paper records of the BBC. We've got miles of film, shed loads of videotape. We've got the archive of the BBC's radio output dating back to the 1920s and 1930s. We've got one of the world's largest commercial music collections. Photos, sheet music, heritage artefacts. We've got the BBC's collection of ornate and ceremonial spoons and sugar cubes. Web and social media archives, and then more recently, a growing archive of digital content. I'm going to talk today mainly about how we manage that digital content and how that gives us new challenges. Before I start, a couple of things I've mentioned. People in the media industry have a traditionally short attention span. So I tend to give presentations of about 10 minutes long, occasionally 5 minutes long, often 2 minutes long. Tonight, as we said, we've got an hour, which is a luxury, I think. So I'll ask you again at the end as to whether you did enjoy that.
It should become a lecture with students with short learning spans.
Yes, yeah, I'll just tweet little tweets, little sort of snippets and things. I was intending on spending the last couple of days polishing this slide deck, making it look a little bit better, doing some rehearsal timings and things. Sadly, I had a family funeral to organise and attend, and so I'm just back this morning for that. So we'll dispose with all of that niceties. It will be absolutely fine. I'll spend probably 40 minutes or so, something like that, talking about this, and there'll be time for questions, and I'm sure we'll have a nice evening. I've also got a cold, so I like to get the excuses out of the way up front. I'm going to talk a lot about archiving. I'm not actually an archivist by trade. I'm an engineer, electronic engineer. Joined the BBC, maintain the equipment, and then building systems for editing TV programmes and making live programmes. So if you see Match of the Day and you see the little highlights edits where we condense a programme down into 5 or 20 minutes, or slow-mos and action replays, and that was all the stuff that I built over the years. And my specialism was in automation control systems, so the software, robust software control for managing routing and switching and control of circuits and systems. But today we're going to be talking about archiving, and I do have the good pleasure of working with 100 or so archivists, and I thought I'd see how good you would be at being archivists. So, audience participation. It's a phrase to strike terror into your heart, along with rail replacement bus service and team building away day, my personal favourite. So, we're all archivists in one way or another. We all have things at home that we hold and we like to look after safely over time, maybe photographs and documents that have been passed down to us, and that we might want to pass down to future generations potentially. And these days, that's being repeated in the digital domain, where we have large digital collections that we've got to manage ourselves at home. So, give yourself a point if you back up your photos and documents. Just in your head, don't do this, don't embarrass yourself or anything. So, give yourself a point for that. If you store your backups away from home, give yourself another point. Just keep count yourself. If you never have the main and backup copies in the same place, give you a third point. And the thing to remember there is if you have a hard drive that you take off site as your backup, that short amount of time when you have it in your house while you're backing it up, everything's in one basket. So if you had a catastrophic failure at that point, then you might lose that. So you either need 2 drives or you need an entirely different approach to managing that. But if you do that, give yourself a point. Give yourself a point if you regularly check all your backups for readability. Do you really know that that hard drive or CD or something you have on the shelf is actually readable? Would you notice if files were missing? If amongst all those hundreds of thousands of documents you've got, if one of them just wasn't there one day, maybe because you dragged it out and it did a move rather than a copy when you intended to email it to somebody, would you notice if it was missing? Would you notice if the file was corrupted, if it just wasn't what it was previously? And then give yourself another point if you migrate content from legacy formats. Do you have any obsolete formats there, zip disks, jazz drives, any of that kind of stuff? And then finally, give yourself the 8th point if you have self-describing backup. So if anybody else needed to pick up your backup and understand what it was, would they be able to make sense of it? And particularly, would they be able to understand where the goodness was in that, where the interesting stuff was? So, did anybody get 8? And I wrote the quiz, so I get 8 from what I manage my backups, the way I manage my backups at home. And I have met people who get 8 and can absolutely justify to me that they did. Anybody 7? 7. Good job. Well done.
I used to be archivist.
Excellent, excellent. It shows. 6, 5, 4, 3 and below. Okay, so must try harder. But it is a real problem for us. Don't feel too bad about it because I've met many systems, both in broadcasting and in other industries, that don't even get 1 on here. You know, proper enterprise IT systems that don't have any form of backup. So so it's not necessarily disastrous for you. The Library of Congress in America created this slide and a lot of other collateral about what to do about your personal digital archiving. And they just say, identify what you want to save, decide what's most important, organise it, make copies, manage your archive over time. And if you do those things, both in your home archive and in your day-to-day work, then you'll be in a really good position. We can talk later about this if you wanted some of the questions. My personal tip, I print out some photos occasionally. So every year I make a photo book of my highlights of the year. I give it to my in-laws. They think I'm doing them a favour, giving them a lovely present. In fact, it's an off-site backup. They store those for me. And then I'm pretty comfortable they'll be readable. They're on archival grade paper. Sometimes you just have to go back to physical. So we're going to talk more about the BBC now. We manage all our archives. I've talked about all the different collections we've got. It's quite expensive and complicated to manage all those, so why do we bother? And we bother because the Queen asks us to. By which I mean that the charter that defines the function and the purpose of the BBC is very specific about the need to maintain an archive. If you go on our website and look at our charter, you'll see, here's a section that talks about our website. It talks about BBC News and sport websites, iPlayer, which I'm sure many of you use, BBC Three, and that's how much we get about all of the BBC's internet presence. That's how much we get about the archive. So you see the archive has a really significant purpose as far as the BBC is concerned.
Is all this up in Upper Regent Street area?
What, the archive, physically? Our physical archive mainly is in Perivale in West London. So on an industrial estate, not a particularly exciting building. Joe, you've been there, haven't you? Vaults and vaults of millions and millions of things. Photo, sheet music, film, videotape.
It's not lovely from the outside. It's not lovely from the outside.
No, it's on a trading estate.
What if a big bomb drops on it or whatever?
We have resilient copies, so I'll get onto it a bit later. But when we're in the digital domain, we have a copy in London, we keep another copy in Scotland, we send another copy somewhere else. In the physical domain, we have duplicate copies of everything that mattered. Our written archive, our paper archive is in Caversham by Reading. That's the only other main archive we've got. But we maintain all that obviously to be able to repeat our programmes, to be able to use it, to make the new programmes strong. But what it's really talking about here is maintaining an archive for the good of the nation. It's a record of what it was like to live in the UK across the last 95 years and what it was like to interact with the BBC across that period.
But a lot of episodes of things from the 60s, for example, are missing, aren't they?
They are, yes. Yeah, there's a history of various of those things happening now. Life is a bit simpler in the digital domain.
Hancock's Half Hour, there's some episodes missing.
There are, and people have recorded those at home and they make their way into us and we add those to our collections. But I say in the digital world, life is a little bit easier.
Yeah.
Much of that was done for the cost of storage and the cost of the storage medium. These days, actually, we know storage is becoming much cheaper, and so it's much easier to be comfortable at keeping everything. So we don't dispose of things these days. The challenge we do have, though, is people want to borrow our stuff. So we could just lock it up in a vault and keep it safe that way, and say nobody's allowed in, and then we'd know it was safe. But at our peak, we were moving 1 million things a year out of our Perivale archive building. It's dropping off a bit now as we're going digital, but we have that challenge of keeping the stuff safe and keeping it accessible. Your local lending library could cope with losing a few books, but we'd rather not lose any of our archive material, so we have to keep multiple copies and make sure we're never lending out the final copy in a physical domain. But it does get easier when we go digital. And on that note, if you were commissioned to make a television programme for the BBC, you would deliver a videotape, a physical thing. And that continued until the 1st of October 2014. And all the UK broadcasters got together and agreed that on that date, if you were commissioned to make a programme, you would deliver a file over the internet to the BBC. And the Digital Production Partnership is a consortium that we all got together under the banner of and came up with the specifications, standards and policies for that. So from that date, we've been building up a growing collection of digital content now. And really we're not taking new physical materials into our archive, other than a tape somebody finds in a drawer somewhere. And we do have tens of petabytes of digital content. But that said, our archive is still primarily physical. But we're working on that. We're working to digitise our archive, to make it more accessible and more available, to protect it against obsolescence and degradation over time, and to improve our storage efficiency. And on that note, for example, BBC Wales, currently out in the sticks near Cardiff, are moving to a really cutting-edge broadcast centre in the centre of Cardiff. And that's entirely IP-based, that's in TCP/IP, end-to-end digital, really cutting-edge broadcast facility, but they don't have any archive space there. So we've just digitised their entire archive for them.
I was in Cardiff last week, I saw it being built.
Yeah, what was a bus station in Central Square, yeah. So that's going up shortly. As you can imagine, no space for a really large archive building in central Cardiff. So we've digitised it for them, and that's hundreds of thousands of videotapes and a lot of audio, quarter-inch audio tapes, CD, DAC, mini-disc, and vinyl. I thought I'd just talk for a second about how we approached that. We obviously archived, or they'd archived all that content. Luckily, they'd also archived the equipment that can play that content. And that's quite a significant thing for us, keeping the machines to be able to play the materials. Even more importantly, we'd archived the experts that knew how to get the best out of the materials and the best out of the machinery. And then even more importantly, we've archived the engineers that knew how to maintain the equipment. So this is what was previously a pinch roll on one of our audio tape machines. Keep it in storage for a few years, and this is really what you get out the other side.
Do you stick with the same media, or do you advance the media as time goes on? So you want to keep, for instance, old film, want to digitise it and store it on a digital medium?
So we're always doing migration, and we have been. So in the sort of 1960s, we were using, in the 70s, 2-inch videotape. That's gone to 1-inch, to digibeta, to D3, to digibeta, to data tape. And even when we hit data tape, we have to keep migrating. So we were using LTO 3 as a data tape standard. We've migrated that to 4, to 5, to 6, to 7. It keeps us busy doing that migration. We generally don't dispose of the previous materials. Under that charter you saw there, we have to offer them to the BFI, British Film Institute, and when we're comfortable we've extracted all the information off it, then the BFI may store that for us over time. Film is a really high resolution standard, and it's really difficult to get all of the information off film, and film is not at risk either. You know, it's lasted 120 years so far, and it's likely to last a bit further, so if it's kept well.
So it bursts into flame.
Not only the early stuff. I'll talk about that in a second actually, I've got a couple of slides on that. So we're migrating over time format to format, and there are occasions where we will leave some of those formats behind us, especially where we can't play them. But yeah, I'll touch on that a little bit further shortly. We run this project. 37 litres of alcohol were consumed in the creation of that Welsh digitalisation project, mainly to moisten 51,000 cotton buds, environmentally friendly cotton buds, wooden buds.
Not for the workers.
I don't know how much went that way, but mainly it went to the cotton buds to clean the heads of the tape machine. So quite a physical, mechanical process that was running there. This is Ripzilla, our homemade CD ripping operation. We have hundreds of thousands of optical discs, and I'll talk a little bit more about them later. But we built our own system using open source software, and we generally write all our own software for all of these operations that just rips through extracting all the contents of all the discs we've got and then putting it into our digital archives that we store it in. But that project's complete. I don't know if you've come across this word before, ingested. Some people who have an aversion to it as a general way of importing something into something. It also, you get the opposite of it, which is outgested, which is an equally awful word. But we have digitised a few 100,000 assets there. The project was totally successful, and here they are. So imagine how much safer now the Welsh Archive is on a data tape than it ever was before. Oh, right, okay. So that isn't really the Welsh Archive, but that's a real problem. As well as your storage density going up, your egg to basket ratio goes up significantly too. And that's a real problem for archive digitalisation projects, that you'll often take a relatively stable physical collection of some sort, and unless you really put into place a digital preservation plan for the long-term management of that content, you haven't necessarily made it better. And I've seen that quite frequently with people taking document archives or archives of significant audio recordings, and they create them, a digital version of them, and they go on a hard drive somewhere, and the hard drive is lost or corrupted or fails over time. And it really would have been much safer for them to stay in the physical domain. So we do digitise it, but where we do, we have to put a lot of effort into making sure that the long-term sort of life of that content is managed, and we sort of give it the attention it deserves.
Are you going to put stuff in the cloud or that?
Yeah, we do use the cloud. I'll come to that slightly later. And the cloud has a place. We've got petabytes of content in the cloud, and it has a place in amongst all of this. But we don't have all our eggs in a single basket generally. On that note about sort of storage over time, this is a slide created by an ex-colleague of mine talking about the advancements in storage technology over time, from stone to paper to film and to disk. And you'll see with each storage advancement, the density goes up by a factor of 1,000, but the lifespan goes down by a factor of 10. So we have stone sort of proto-cuneiform tablets from about 5,000 years ago, still going very strong. Paper, we've got the Dead Sea Scrolls from a couple of thousand years ago, Doomsday Book, almost 1,000 years, still very readable and very understandable. Film, as we touched on a bit earlier there, about 120 years old so far, and the early stuff is really still in good condition if it was kept safely across that time. But disk starts to get a bit tenuous now. Disk meaning optical disks and also hard disks. 10 years is sometimes pushing it a bit to get content off disks and hard drives. It really gives us a problem there.
But with books now, the quality of paper is pretty good compared with years ago.
Oh yes,
so
yeah.
I think they're going to last quite a long time.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And it's really the digital stuff that worries us more than anything there. So to look at some of the degradation here, here's a bit of film. We touched on earlier, the really early film was cellulose nitrate, which by definition is rocket fuel. We still use that chemical as rocket fuel these days. So it wasn't that it degraded to be explosive, it's always been explosive. It's a really bad thing to put it in front of a really bright bulb that you're projecting. So over the years there have been many really bad accidents involved in that. But there's always health and safety moving you on and making things safer, but not necessarily making things better. See also cleaning fluids. So here this is cellulose acetate, and this is definitely safer. It doesn't explode like the cellulose nitrate, but it does degrade. And unless it's kept in really optimum conditions, which really means freezing, then the acetate bit, the acetic acid, leaches out of this film, and you get this differential shrinkage, and basically the emulsion falls off. And it's not great. A couple of things about this though, you notice it happening. So we open our film cans and we measure them with pH strips, and generally we smell them a bit, and if they smell of vinegar, you start to worry about them. So if they don't smell of vinegar and they don't look like that, then you can be relatively comfortable it's safe. The other thing about this is it's recoverable. So that was a reel of film that we saw played on a machine, and you would almost not know it came from that. It was actually, you can see amongst there the little bits of pictures there somewhere, and it plays relatively well. It wasn't the catastrophic failure that you might think having looked at that bit of film. Have you heard of disk rot on CDs and DVDs? So CDs, especially the ones you burn at home, are a little bit tenuous anyway. So a laser you're allowed to have in your home to be able to burn plastic is not of a sufficient power to really create permanent disks. And mainly there's a lot of chemistry and physics going on to create these disks that you can burn in your home. And so different layers and different things interacting with each other.
So are you saying a DVD movie won't last forever?
It depends how it was made, but generally not. So if made well and if pressed in volume, you know, if it's one you bought in the shop, you've got a reasonable chance.
But it should depend if it's bimetal versus dye.
Yes, yeah, a whole range of different things about it as to how it's made. Occasionally, as I say, the commercial ones are generally okay, but they get batch problems. So there'll be a manufacturing fault on some discs. On the early laser discs, they had quite a few batch problems. That's actually a commercially produced disc there that's suffered from just some rot here. But as you say, it depends on how they're made. A lot of organisations are very good about buying from the lowest bidder and spending the least possible money they can on discs and suffering from that in the long term. Even if the discs are made well, occasionally you get batch problems obviously, but then people write on them with permanent markers with some nasty solvent in, or they stick stickers on them, or not noticing that it's the top layer of the CD that's actually got the data on really. So the bottom millimetre is just a bit of plastic, it's the top that you really have to protect much more than the bottom. So when we come to look at...
Is the top with the word, you know?
That's it, yeah. So that's the bit you want to protect most safely. You can always polish a few some microns off the bottom and get it back to something usable. And we do that where necessary. But when we come to digitise or make safe part of our archive, the optical disc collections are the ones that give us most problems, the ones that we have most failure rates trying to read. So if you have at home your photos backed up onto CD, it's worth going and reading those and making sure you can still get all the content off those, because we do see a lot of that not lasting as long as it was really intended to.
If you've got a bad, if you've got a bad quality disc, say you got from a library on a loan, is that possible that it can damage your player in any way?
If it was warped or if there was something physically wrong with it, it could. But if it's physically okay, then generally it's okay for your player.
Okay.
I mean, where things have they'll get very scratched if you get them from the library, and you'll see that. And you can, and we've got equipment to repolish that, and then you can get it usable again. But it's unlikely to damage your equipment. But really, it's just about, if this was the unique recording of a particular hour of a BBC radio output, then we're disappointed if we can't read that somehow. Normally we have multiple copies, and you can try in different machines of the vintage that made it in the first place are sometimes better at playing it. Bizarrely, the rewritable discs are actually better. So they use a different mechanism. Rather than burning pits with lasers, they use a sort of phase change, amorphous and crystalline phase change, and that's actually better in the long term. That's what Blu-rays and things use. So the rewritable disc has stood the test of time better than the what you might think of the permanently writable discs. There are some disk formats that are actually made for the long term, some archive disk formats. Various manufacturers have made them over the years, and they do stand the test of time. But your average CD that you bought in a shop, you can't really tell until you wait and see how it goes. But you can start to worry about CDs as a format. Hard disks, single hard disks like this, give us a lot of problems too. So you can't tell by looking at that whether that hard drive's failed, and if it has failed, well, good luck, really. You could possibly pay a data recovery specialist to strip that down and put the platters on another system and try and get the data off it, but it's not perfectly successful, that. So we worry more about content sitting on a hard drive than we ever did about it sitting on film. So, the other thing, if we sort of progress to the bottom here, is the extension down here will be into cloud, into the virtual world. And much as we love cloud for cost effectiveness and scalability, it doesn't really lend itself to content permanence by default. So if we had some film, maybe we recorded the Queen's coronation in 1953, we'd have to think long and hard before we put that film in the bin. But these days, we've got content being made in the cloud, flowing to another cloud. Unless you actively go and archive it intentionally, then it can often pass you by. And for that and other reasons, it's often said we're the generation like to leave least behind us for future generations. And I'll touch on that a little bit later as well.
Don't forget it's a royal wedding on Saturday.
I know.
We're that probably.
No, and the royal wedding, we're spending a lot of time archiving that because it's going out in ultra high definition, 4K, high dynamic range, so a variety of really cutting edge technologies, and we're making sure we're archiving all of that well. I had a call about that earlier today. What can we do about that then? Now, from broadcasters, the main thing we have to do is get our plumbing right. So when we're doing all this cutting edge stuff, we have to make sure we've got a natural route to archive. Whenever anybody's creating any data that we want to have a life beyond its initial use, then we make sure that it's making its way to the archive naturally. Lots of copies keep stuff safe. The more copies you have of your content, both within your organisation and globally, the more likely that content is to survive. So if you want your wedding video to last forever, give it to all your friends, put it on YouTube, upload it to the Internet Archive, or best of all, seed it on BitTorrent called Star Wars Episode 10 Rough Cut, and then you'll get immediate global geo-replication, copies of it around the world. I mentioned the Internet Archive there. I don't know if you're aware of this. They crawl the Internet. They have done since the 1990s and archive pretty much all of it. As you see, they've got 327 billion web pages. You can go and search there for any page that's existed on the Internet at any point in time, and there's a reasonable chance they'll have it. I mean, they don't do all of the BBC website, they just do selected highlights, but it's there. What people don't often know is there's an upload button. So if you have something you think is significant, and they don't measure that, it's up to you, you can just upload it to the Internet Archive and it will live forever. So as long as you're happy for it to be publicly available, then upload your videos, music, anything like that to the Internet Archive, and it will live on. If you want your content to live longer than the system it's currently in, you have to consider the principles of digital preservation. That's our rule of thumb, really, if you really want your stuff to live on. Storage is generally about keeping stuff safe today, and then preservation is about how you keep it safe over time. That's the distinction we sort of make in the archiving world. Things most important to us, really, in considering technology systems is exit planning. And many people might be involved in contractual exit planning, how you get from one supplier to the next, how they assist you with termination and things like that. But this is more about how you get back what you put in. And generally, don't put anything of yours into something unless you know how you're going to get it back out again afterwards. So, a few examples on that. What often happens in broadcasting is a post-production company, an editing company making TV programs, will have all their systems they're using, and they'll have some backup systems as well. And they'll make some backup data tapes. And then they'll go bankrupt, as often happens in the media world, and I'll be handed a box of data tapes and said, here's all the stuff that they were holding. And the first question is, what system made these? Can I have the software that made these backup tapes? To which the answer is normally no, or nobody really knows what it was, they've gone bankrupt, we don't know what version it was. And then the worst bit is, can I have the database that described what was on these tapes? Because many IT backup systems just put fragments of data on tapes. And there's no file system, and they're not even contiguous files. And you need that metadata database to try and knit it all together. And it's rare for that to live on as long as the data tapes do. So really we want to make sure that we haven't just got a backup, we've got something we can access if we needed to over time. The other thing that happens is you put your content into a system, but then you organise it and do things with it when it's in that system. And we want to be really sure that that data can come back out again as well. So a practical example from that, at home I've got a lot of photos, like we talked about earlier, and I've used some off-the-shelf bits of software to manage those. And I was a bit worried about putting my photos in and starting to build up little collections of my favourites. Could I ever get that metadata, that data back out again afterwards? And so I tested that with the software I was using, and I could see that whenever I made a collection, it was actually moving things around on disk. And I sort of liked that, because I could see a folder called highlights of my holiday to Wales. And then there was a version upgrade, which I don't actually remember agreeing to, but it happened at some point. And whoever wrote this new version decided it would be much better if all the stuff was just sprinkled randomly on the disk and there was a database that held it all together. A proprietary database that you don't have access to. So it was fine when it was in that system, but when I had too many photos basically, and it could no longer cope with the number of photos I had, I thought I'll just move to something else. And it was really hard. There was no button that said give me back all the work I'd done on that system. Coming from a software background, I spent quite a lot of time writing some software to sort of reverse engineer that database and get the data out of it, and I did it. But that was a lesson for my work life, really, of if we're going to make a digital archive and have teams of archivists organising content in there, I want to be really sure that that data has a life beyond the system it's in. Another practical example, the BBC Radio Archive is millions of little files, of audio files, and they're in a system stored on data tape, and if you request one of them, if you double-click on one, it goes and gets it, the robot arm moves, it selects the right tape, it puts it into the drive, it reads the file off, and a couple of minutes later you've got the file. Technically, it can give me all the content back. But if I ask for one of those, it goes and does what I just said there. If I ask for the next one, the robot arm goes and gets a different tape, it puts it in the tape drive, and it gives me the file back, taken a couple of minutes ago. I've got millions of these, and if you do the maths, it's going to take about 100 years to give me back all that content. What I really wanted to do is pick a single data tape out of off its shelf and empty the contents of that tape from start to finish. But there's not a button for that. It's a very well-known storage product we use for that, but there isn't a give me all your stuff back button. So again, we had to write some software for that. We had to delve into their databases, understand what was on each tape, and understand the order that it was on that tape, and then ask for it specifically in that exact order so that it could be given back to us on the drive, on the tape drive.
Does that have implications for GDPR when individuals want to request their data from the past to be taken out, that one is confronted with these challenges?
Yeah, I think GDPR is a slightly different challenge because sometimes it's about erasure, and erasure and archives are sort of often diametrically opposed. There is an exemption, a derogation, Article 89 of the GDPR is about keeping things for archive purposes. I'm not in any way a lawyer, I wouldn't like to comment on it, but archive organisations have other mechanisms for keeping stuff over time they might want to. So for example, some museums, it was being suggested they'd have to destroy their deposit books, saying who gave them all these things because it was personally identifying information. But they seem more comfortable about that now. But yes, that particular point I was talking about there was really about getting stuff back in bulk. So getting individual things is okay, and getting a few hundred would be okay. Asking for a million things just sometimes breaks storage systems. And so you have to imagine what you would do to try and get all that content out in bulk. What we do with any of the systems we've got is that we do an exercise before we start to use it with real content. We put content in and we do everything you could possibly want to do to that content. And we make sure we can get all the content back and all that data we just added to the system. And that's part of our ready for operation planning. And then when we know it can do that, we're happy to pour all our archive in. But that's really from the experience of some of those examples I just talked about. We're probably familiar with the various ways we can lose content on systems. Catastrophic failure, flood, burst pipe is my favourite there. We see that relatively frequently. Particularly there'll be a sprinkler system in here somewhere, and it's possible that the compression joints were tightened up slightly more than they were supposed to be, and the olives in there will crack at some point over time and spew really nasty, rusty, dirty water all over the systems. I've had that happen a few times over my career. So I never, when somebody shows a big system and say, what could possibly go wrong? Well, it's normally the water pipe that's on top of it. Things wear out over time. We get physical degradation. Things that are physical don't always last forever. Gradual digital variation, I'll come back to in a second. Content just subtly varying over time in a way that you weren't expecting. And the thing that we touched on earlier around migration, inability to read a legacy medium, that's the thing that keeps me in a job, which is how formats become obsolete and we have to migrate from one onto the next. But even if all those things go well, and I manage to get back the file that I archived 10 years ago, maybe it's a WordPerfect 5.1 file or a Lotus 123 spreadsheet or something, and they don't have those importers anymore. The modern version of Microsoft Office can't read a Lotus 123 file unless you install some other importer that you probably don't have admin rights to install. So understanding files, keeping it valid and current becomes a problem for us. And then the main killer at the bottom is human error. That's the one that causes to, puts you at risk of losing more than you could imagine in other ways. Well-meaning systems administrators tidying things up, clearing a bit of space, as you often have to do.
So they may delete something by mistake.
Absolutely, yes. Or do a move when they meant to do a copy and all those sort of things.
You have to do a risk assessment exercise, which
Yes.
is very common today, isn't it?
Yeah, and one thing we particularly do, I like to do, is we keep multiple copies, as I talked about earlier, of all our content. I like it that no one person has access to more than one copy. So a system administrator, how much we trust them, shouldn't have right administrative access to the first copy and the second one and others. Just as a good practice. The other thing that happens in those cases where somebody does have all 3 copies mounted as drives on their computer is that they get a ransomware virus on their machine, and it goes and encrypts all the copies that they got mounted. So really segmenting your administrative team so that they can only see one copy at a time is a good tip there. I touched there on the gradual digital variation that we can see with digital content. And so, well, it seems like science fiction here, but there are a variety of reasons where data can just flip, bits can just flip of their own accord due to thermal instability, cosmic radiation, the other things I talk about there. And the more you pack data together, the worse that gets. So actually, data tape isn't bad. Data tape, if you roll that all out, it would be a reasonably large surface area. Hard drives are getting tighter and tighter. They're not adding more platters, they're just getting the density of the data up. And so we start to see more problems with bit flipping, bit rot on that. There's always mechanisms on those technologies to detect some errors and recover from them, but they have a limit. And the manufacturers quote what the limits are, how much error rates you'd expect that are undetectable and unrecoverable.
So
Is there a limit?
Yes, go on.
Is there a limit to the amount you can compress stuff now?
Pretty much, yeah. We're almost at the thermodynamic limit of how much you can get things close to each other. And you have to start to go out in other dimensions and do other
That's
things.
on a disk, though. They could bring out another medium, couldn't they?
Well, you're reaching, I mean, there's sort of quantum storage and all those things coming, but you're starting to reach physical limits, and you have to think of other ways. Like, generally things are 2-dimensional, and you can start to go off onto 3 dimensions and all those things. But if you speak with experts about that, they're almost at the limit of what they can do with some of that.
So it's actually pretty safer using a storage medium which isn't compressed to the max, using something that's slightly older or less cheaper that's not actually the latest, biggest amount of memory on a certain.
Well, that's it. So we use a lot of data tape, and data tape is generally designed for the long term. One thing I would say, in case I forget to say later, a lot of these media will say 25-year life. And that's it's good to know that it would last 25 years. That isn't a guarantee that they're going to continue to make the equipment to replay it for 25 years. Often they only make that for 3 or 4 or 5, so you have to consider that. But generally...
I've got a VHS and a Betamax player.
Right. A VHS, I mean, we still have some VHS. We've generally digitised ours. We don't have that much Betamax. That lost the war, sadly, Betamax.
Yeah.
Although Betamax... The technology that was in Betamax became the technology that was used for broadcast videotape machines. So if I didn't bring along today, if I brought along a videotape that we were using today for all the high-definition content, it's the same shape and the same design, exactly the same as Betamax.
They said at the time Betamax was technically better.
It was, yeah.
VHS had more marketing and money behind it.
Yeah, it was a different licensing arrangement with Sony who made it, and it was a reasonable gamble, but it wasn't the one that won. The VHS was a bit more of an open format. There were more manufacturers working.
These people are too young to remember all this.
Yes, I had a Philips V2000 machine.
Actually 78.
We've got wax cylinders in the BBC archive, just to meet anyone there, hopefully. The manufacturers of all these storage media are not secretive about the error rates. They will quote all over their website what the error rates are. So if you look at data tape, the undetectable, unrecoverable error rate quoted by the manufacturer, 1 times 10 to the minus 17. So 1 with 17 noughts after the end, we have a chance of 1 in that of seeing an undetectable, unrecoverable error. And that's an astronomically small number. We shouldn't really get worried about that. Apart from the fact we've got a lot of content. So one of our digitization projects, we digitized one of our tape formats, and we got about 30 petabytes of content back from that. So that's what 30 petabytes look like. And if I multiply those two together, which I probably shouldn't because they're curves and bell curves and things, but if I did anyway, there's a chance of error. We would expect to see on a large digitization project like that, some bits flipped across that. But it doesn't spontaneously arrive on a data tape. It goes through other systems before it gets there, and it goes through enterprise hard disk drives, 10 to the minus 15, so 100 times worse. And so I'm starting to see more errors there. You don't really know whether all your hard disk drives are enterprise grade, so they start to quote a different figure for more domestic hard drives. All those hard disk drives plug into a hard disk controller. No matter how good your drive is, you're going to a controller with this sort of error rate. Worst of all is computer memory. You can buy ECC memory, the error correcting memory, which is vastly better. But particularly if you buy appliances, you don't really know what's in them sometimes. So you don't know what memory is being used. And if you're using normal computer memory, you see a lot of errors. And I've seen some stats quoted that if you're flattening a gigabit wire with data all day long, passing through normal computers, you can expect to see 1 bit flip every day on that. And the worst of all is multi-path, so I'm not taking a single path through each one of those things. I'm going in and out of memory many times, and in and out of disk many times. And so there's a reasonable chance of seeing corruption. And in fact, we see it regularly. When you're dealing with large volumes of data, and when you're specifically looking for it, you will see some corruption of data as it passes by you. CERN, the Hadron Collider, BBC typo there, but CERN, the people that do the Hadron Collider, did a data study on that, and they said they found error rates at the 10 to minus 7 level, and that's really scary. You know, that's an awful lot of corruption. Now, I think in there they considered catastrophic failures they had, hard drive array failures and things like that, but they have to be very cautious. They don't want to announce they found the God particle and then find it was just a bit that got flipped. So they have to put a lot of mechanisms in place to make sure they really trust the data that they're working with. Is it anybody's birthday? No. Happy birthday. So this was not about being anybody's birthday, but about the birthday paradox. Have you heard of this? A statistical anomaly or interesting things? How many people do you have to have in a room before it's more likely than not that two people share the same birthday?
23.
It's exactly 23. That's the answer. So, but it doesn't feel right. You'd think, how many people do you have to have before you guarantee you've got the same, two people got the same birthday? That's going to be 366 or something. But for it to be more likely than not, the answer is 23. And you can do this. If we had 23 people, which sadly we don't, you can normally have a go to see if people have got the same birthday.
Well, I went to the hospital the other week, and there was a guy the same name as me and the same date of birth.
Yes.
But their system didn't check our address,
Oh, right.
postcodes.
You've still got your legs.
So I went for his
yeah.
appointment.
Right.
I wondered what was wrong with me.
Yes, but it's that sort of thing that generally statistics is not obvious. And so, for example, imagine I've got 10 assets in my archive. I've got more, but imagine I've just got 10. And I keep a second copy of those somewhere else. And if I start to see a bit of corruption, what's the chance of me losing one copy on this side and losing the same copy on the other? But if you've only got 10, you think, well, there's a reasonable chance actually of me losing my second copy. But what if I had 1 million now? You think, well, that's much less likely. But the 10 aren't suddenly safer because they've got 1 million next to them. Actually, the volume of content you've got cancels out in the maths. And so you find that rules of thumb and general feelings about being safe because you've got so much stuff are generally not true when you do the maths. So you have to be much more cautious about it. So what can you do about it? RAID, you've heard of RAID arrays, redundant array of drives and things. Well, that doesn't work. So that's great for hard drive failures, for losing a drive. It's generally not good for detecting small corruptions like that. There are some RAID systems that do background checking, background scrubbing, but most of them don't. Most of them are there to cope with a drive failure, and they won't alert you if random bits are flipped here and there. Similarly, you can keep multiple copies, and that feels good, because now one amongst those is probably good. But unless you're actually checking which one is the good one, then that doesn't give you any extra benefit. Especially when you come to migrate your systems, you're probably going to focus on one of your copies only. And unless you have absolute confidence in that being what it always was, then you would worry about corruption occurring. So what can you do? You can assume an imperfect carrier. And those of us that have dealt with satellite links know how to deal with that. So if you're sending data, important data over a satellite link, you really know that you're going to get corruption on that link, and you make sure you recover from it. You make sure you have loads of mechanisms in place to detect and recover from that very thoroughly. And generally, if it moves, checks on it. So whenever we're moving anything around the archive between any site and we're storing it from our data tapes or anything, we make a fingerprint, a checksum, an MD5, or an SHA1 or an SHA256 or something, a fingerprint to make sure it is what it used to be. And we try to make that checksum for the first time as early as we possibly can. So as soon when we make the file, when we check the file, it gets a checksum then, and it lives with it then forever. The other thing is if it doesn't move, checksum it. So the nature of archives is a lot of our content doesn't get used year on year. So we will archive something, and then it might be 10 years before we come to access it. And that's a very bad time to find that it's been corrupted. And you might have not had your, you might have migrated your second copy since then, for example. So we check all our content every year to make sure we've still got it. Our central digital archive automatically rereads every piece of content we've got and revalidates it against a checksum every year. And if there is an issue, which for the maths we should see issues, it goes to its second copy and third copy potentially and restores that and automatically heals itself. And that's becoming the norm these days from archiving systems. In 1986, the BBC ran a project called Doomsday. This was, are you familiar with this? It was the 900th anniversary of the original Doomsday book, commissioned by William the Conqueror in 1086 as the first census of the whole country. It was a groundbreaking project. The country was divided up into 23,000 rectangles, and schools across the country contributed video, images, text, sounds of what was going on around them. It remains to this day the largest crowdsourced project in the UK. 1 million people contributed to the creation of the disk and the dataset. And it was hugely successful. Hundreds of thousands of images and maps were created as a result of that. It was very much ahead of its time for 1986. If you saw this today, and this is one of the user interface elements to it, you'd think it was Google Street View. We're clicking through, using a mouse, the town of Brecon in Wales. And if you let it roll on a bit, we go to a shop and interact with some of the people there and talk about what they're doing. But this was 1986. It predates the World Wide Web, it predates Wikipedia, obviously. The technology looked like that. It was a BBC 8-bit microcomputer, a master computer, and an analog laserdisc, modified to store digital data. Absolute success. These units were in schools and libraries across the country. Really groundbreaking. And it was intended that this system, the data, would be passed down through generations alongside the original Doomsday Book. And as I talked about earlier, the original Doomsday Books lasted 930 years today, very much still readable. Our ability to read the content of that disk lasted about 10 years. And that wasn't because the disk itself degraded, although actually we're seeing bit rot, we're seeing disk rot on some of those disks now, just for the time they've been around. But mainly due to obsolescence of all that kit you see there. So even if we could have one of these running, and there are a couple still running, there's one at the Cambridge Computing Museum still running there, it's very difficult to get the data off it. There have been some projects to try and extract the data from this, not totally successfully. Some of that was rehosted on the BBC website. We've just taken it down for GDPR reasons, because it's full of a lot of personally sensitive information. The other thing about it, I don't know why it's done that, intellectual property and ownership, which wasn't really thought of so much in 1986, has become a bit of a problem in the intervening years. Generally, people didn't sign release forms. So when a school child has written a poem or described what was going on around them or taken a picture, it's not really clear whether they're allowed to use that. And equally, the people that did sign release forms, it's very explicit about it being used in the context of that disk. Because we were nice, and we didn't want to take somebody's photo and sell it around the world, we said we will take your photo to be used on this disk. And it almost expressly forbade us to put it on the internet. So we generally worry about things like that. But the moral of the story really is if you're at the cutting edge of technology, you have to be very careful about your archiving decisions. Just for interest, we have a good archive of CFAX, but it's almost accidental. Many people have archives of CFAX because it was accidentally recorded on VHS machines. So CFAX, the data is at the top of the picture in its vertical interval. And some VHS machines, and definitely SVHS machines, are able to store that. So many people still have an archive of all that went out over decades on CFAX over the years. If you're doing something that other people might already have done, or might be doing as well, then standards become very important to you. And we use a lot of standards in our day-to-day life in the BBC Archive. Are you familiar with ISO 3103? Many of you might use this. The method consists of extracting soluble substances in dry tea leaf. It's the ISO standard for making a cup of tea. It's not a facetious standard, it's really there to calibrate tea-making equipment to make sure that it all behaves equally. And it says here all the things you need to do when you're making a pot of tea. As it says here, though, the protocol has been criticised for omitting any mention of pre-warming the pot. It also, somebody's pointed out to me, it also puts the milk in first, which I'm not really sure is the done thing. I don't drink tea, so I don't really know much about that. The nice thing about standards is you have so many to choose from. And then this is really common around archive file formats particularly. There are 14 competing standards. What should we do about that? We're going to develop one universal standard that covers everybody's use case. The result is we've got 15 competing standards. And that's very much the world we live in around archiving. Let's skip over that one. Just to mention for interest, PDF. You probably use PDF a lot. Are you familiar with the archive variant of that? So PDF-A, and particularly PDF-A 1B. So PDFs, their goal in life a lot of the time is to be as small as possible. So there's no need for a PDF file to include the Times New Roman font because everybody's got it, haven't they? And so generally PDFs are the minimum you need to describe something. They're not fully self-describing. So the archive variants of PDF include embedded within them everything they need to self-describe that. They purposely use very simple compression. There's no JavaScript, there's nothing interesting going on like that. Most systems can make a PDF-A 1B, and that becomes a friendly, archive-friendly standard we guarantee will be readable over time. One of the standards that matters most to us is the OAIS, the Open Archival Information System. It's the international standard for archiving. And if you read it, you'll notice Space Data Systems is often mentioned in there. And that's because the primary author of that document was NASA, the American Space Agency. And NASA are quite interesting for running very long projects. So the Space Shuttle program ran from 1969 to 2011. It was a 42-year project. I know we all feel like we've had 42-year projects, but the data they created on the first day, all their designs and specifications and standards, had to be totally readable 42 years later when they launched the last space shuttle. So they had to deal with everything we've talked about today about migrating data between formats and keeping it alive, just to let the program run, not really for long-term archiving. Brief thing about the cloud. Preservation, keeping something safe forever, and making it accessible to people don't have to be served by the same technology. So we like using the cloud for access. It's great for scalability, it's really fast. It doesn't always lend itself to long-term preservation, but you don't have to have one solution meeting both those requirements. If you write a spec that says my storage has to be incredibly fast, accessible by millions of people, and secure for 100 years, that would be quite expensive. If you split it into two, it gets much cheaper than half the first one. So, very briefly, web archiving. We do archive the BBC's web output. In the early days, we used to archive the components for the pages, the ingredients for the pages, and when you were building static web pages, that was enough. These days, our pages are so dynamic, driven by databases, that's not really enough for us. So we crawl the BBC's website. We crawl it regularly. We go around clicking the buttons as if you were a user and archiving all of that, getting hundreds of millions of pages back from that. We store them in a standard. We like standards. But then again, we worry about the readability over time, so we also make a PDF-A of every page that we archive. So we've got hundreds of millions of PDFs just showing exactly what every page on the BBC website looked like over time. We also archive the BBC's Twitter output. We just subscribe to the feeds as if you were any user, and we've got a system we built that just archives the BBC's output on Twitter. Again, briefly, link rot is another rot that worries us. I wrote a guide for digital archiving for somebody, and I had 10 links in it to 10 publications on digital archiving. Between me writing it and then publishing it, 5 of them didn't work. Links have a very short lifespan these days. There are things you can do about that. The Internet Archive particularly has a little bookmark thing where you can say, I want to cite this page, and it will upload it, it will archive it, and it will give you back a permanent link that will give you a copy of that page existing over time. You really don't want to trust that somebody else's link is going to continue working.
So a quick question?
Yes, yes.
If academics like doing footnotes and,
Yes.
and they refer to links,
That's it.
should they go to the Internet Archive and do
Definitely.
that?
And if you go to the Internet Archive, they've got a specific thing about citations in academic journals and how best to do that. And there's also something called DOIs, digital object identifiers. It's another related thing about citing other people's works in a way that's guaranteed to exist over time. So Google DOI and also look for web archiving citation, and you'll get some good links on all that. There was a time when people were really struggling with that, where you would cite a lot of stuff, and by the time your professor read it, none of the links worked anymore. You could use it to your advantage. You could cite things that claim to exist, but I shouldn't say that. One final thing, really, I'll end on. We create tens of thousands of data tapes, and we worry, from our own experience of trying to read other people's data tapes, we worry whether people will be able to read ours in the future. And so we create documentation, like all of you do, I'm sure, very thorough documentation. The novel thing I think we do is we put that documentation on every single data tape we write. So on every tape we write, we've got a full specification for everything you'll find on that tape. So here, for example, we talk about all the file formats you'll find on there and why they exist and what the file describes. We have the full specification for any of the file formats used, especially the more esoteric ones. We've got some white papers on how to understand the content of the data tape that you'll find. We've got the source code on every tape that created the contents of that tape, and we've got a source code set that will allow you to replay any of the files on that tape as well. We've got a full data set for the entire project, not for just the contents of that tape, but for the entire set, so you can see where that tape sits in the context of everything else. We've also got videos. We like video, being the BBC, so we shot some videos with the people involved in delivering this digitalisation project and describing the end-to-end workflow of how the files and content were created. And all of those videos sit on every single data tape out of the tens of thousands we make. And we feel it's a bit like the plaque on the side of the Pioneer spacecraft. So if one of those data tapes was separated from its herd, or if some future life form came across all those data tapes, they'd have a really good idea, really good chance of being able to get the best out of it. I wrote a guide, it was that guide I talked about earlier, I wrote for the Digital Production Partnership on digital archiving, mainly aimed at the broadcast sector. But if you Google DPP digital archiving, you can download that, and it goes into a lot more detail than I have done today about keeping digital content safe over time. But mainly my sort of request to you, my sort of challenge to you is, when you leave here and you cause data to be created, have a think about the lifespan you'd like that data to have, and see if there's anything you can do now to give that a better chance of turning out the way you'd hoped. So that's it from me. Time for questions if anybody hasn't answered something as we went along, or asked something.
Yeah, no, excellent, Steve. Thank you. So, questions? Ed?
Fascinating presentation. Scary as well.
Yes, yes.
How do you, do you provide a checklist to the content providers of the things you're going to archive later on? And the formats you want it in, and I mean, how do you...
Yeah, we do. So the BBC probably commissions more programmes than it makes these days. And so we've got a much more contractual arrangement with the people making programmes, which luckily causes us to be much more specific about what we're asking them to do. The same as anybody else, Netflix or Amazon, when they're asking somebody to make a programme for them, there's a really big list of deliverables, which is a nasty word again, but deliverables are things they have to deliver. Some of those things we're quite prescriptive. So the programme that we transmit has to be absolute standard. And we're really fussy about that being exactly the same. And that's the thing we generally keep forever. But we also archive the artifacts of making a TV programme. So all their raw materials and their rushes and things like that, what they actually shot on their camera. And we generally archive those natively in the format they were in. I did have a slide I didn't have time for about that, but it's a bit like film negatives. They're quite tricky to work with, but they're unarguably a copy of the original. So we'd much rather archive things in the form they were in. So if somebody uses a digital SLR, they keep a raw images from that. We'd like to archive exactly that raw image, because it's perfect, it's genuine, and we'll be able to, I'm sure we'll be able to recover it at some point in the future.
So that's documented in the contract that they...
Yeah, absolutely. There's some standard terms in the contract for the things you have to deliver, and then if a programme is special, like for example the Royal Wedding in the coming weekend, we've got many more deliverables we're keeping for the archive for just a long-term reason. So there is a sort of value judgment on how many different artifacts we need from each programme. But no, it's very contractual these days. And generally it's about paying them once they deliver what they should. So we have to, and we try to run that by systems these days. So we try to make it so that people deliver against a system, and then that system can say you've done your work now and pay them.
Sounds
Sorry,
this.
Well, it's a quickie really, and that is, how has the cost of archiving changed over time, recent time?
It's become less manual. So the number of people in BBC archives doing manual cataloguing has reduced over time, sadly. Those people are doing other things now, but there was a time when you would have to watch a programme to transcribe it, to say what happened in it. And these days we try and make use of data feeds for that. So for example, the programme guide you see on your television is a really good description of what a programme is. And 100% of the BBC's output is subtitled these days. So you get a lovely text description of everything that was in a programme. And actually, a lot of our content has audio description. If you press the AD button on your remote, it tells you what's happening. So if you happen, if you're blind or have visual impairment and you can't see the screen, it tells you what's going on. And we get the script data for that. So automation really helps us. And machine learning and ability to analyse that data helps take out some of the more manual processes. Generally, things haven't got cheaper when they got digital. There had been this assumption that digital makes life cheaper. It generally hasn't. So a van moving tapes around is relatively cheap. Moving or digitising content and moving it over the internet isn't as cheap. But that's a bit of a hump. It's a bit of a peak we're going through as we digitise the archive and as we build up a store, and then it can become much more self-service. And we hope over time, particularly with Moore's law applying to storage costs, and with storage costs drastically reducing over time, then we hope it will sort of level out a bit. But we have to keep up with all the changes. That's the main thing that worries us. So when we deliver to new platforms, we've got to make sure we're plugged into them.
Yeah.
So our time is less spent on manual work and more on keeping up with plugging into all the new ways we communicate with our audiences.
Yes, I can't see it getting cheaper.
No, it's generally digital in a lot of industries doesn't make things cheaper, sadly.
It sounds like a lot of the technologies that you're using are homegrown, developed in-house. I mean, is that because there isn't any proprietary service available you can use, or are you the world-leading experts at this?
No, it depends what we're doing. So our digital archive, where we store all that content, is absolutely off the shelf. And our storage layer, storing all that content, again, absolutely off the shelf. That's solved problems, everybody does that. Digitising our legacy videotapes, it's difficult to buy things that do exactly what we want. And so we buy modules. We buy the bit that takes a video signal and converts it to a file, and all the glue, and particularly workflow, all the thing that manages all the processes and data processing around it, we write ourselves. We would rather buy the whole thing off the shelf. We don't want to be too egotistical about us being special, but we weigh up whenever we do something, whether we should be buying it off the shelf or whether we would be better building it ourselves, rather than asking people to customise their systems quite for sort of unique way that we've worked over the years. So, I mean, our development team for everything we do in BBC Archives is about 4 people. It's not a huge set of hundreds of people doing development. It's for broadcast engineers, actually, who've come from a very traditional engineering background, some of whom have done 43 years in the BBC and are these days writing Python and just writing software to drive all these processes.
Sorry,
So
question.
following from that, just in that vein, the processes that you mentioned, so there's a process workflow and then there's technical stuff, like acetates and you mentioned before you had a list of ISOs and standards.
Ah, yes, yeah.
So what do those refer to? The technical side? That was a good page, actually.
Yes, that wasn't what I was hoping it was. Let me just see what... and that was a tiny subset of the standards. I mean, those of us with similar job titles to me spend a lot of time talking about standards and working with people like the EBU, the European Broadcasting Union, and SMPTE, the Society of Motion Picture and Television Engineers in America, on the standards they use. So some of these are very well known. ISO 27001 for data security, very important to us. That was the NASA standard I talked about there. This was about how to store things safely on optical disk. If you do have a digital repository, this is a common one to make sure you've still got it. IDs is really important to us. So that thing you asked about earlier about, are we contracting people to deliver things? It's difficult to know whether they have unless you've given it a really good unique ID. And so in the broadcast industry, there is no universal unique ID for a piece of media. Many people have tried in the way I talked about earlier. There's many competing standards, but we would love there to be an ID that everybody uses. And then we're talking about some file formats, and we have a lot of file formats we use. This was somewhere I had...
Do you communicate with NASA?
No, not really. No, we do occasionally and rarely.
You could take a trip to Florida.
Yes, we are publicly funded. I don't normally get away with that. This was something I didn't talk about, National Digital Stewardship Alliance. This is a really good standard about, are you storing things safely? And they measure various things about, are you storing it geographically resilient? Are you checking it's still there? Is it secure from an information security perspective? Are the file formats good over time? And then you measure how good you're doing. And I've seen this grid completed with some red, amber, green for a variety of different storage providers and cloud providers. And it's a good grid to use to see how good your own system is. And ideally it's green all the way across there, but it isn't always. Yes, yeah.
A question about photos. I mean, often they exist in JPEG format.
Yeah.
But what about the long-term storage? Would you keep them in JPEG, or would you convert them to a PDF or any other?
Is that for digitally born photos?
I mean, both physical. I mean,
Yeah.
physical photos, when you scan them, they're often in JPEG format. But also, when you take new photos,
Yeah.
take photos now, then they are in JPEG format when you have them?
Yeah, so when we scan photos, we tend to use variants of TIFF for storing, which is losslessly compressed. So generally uncompressed, occasionally it uses a bit of run length encoding, so it's a load of white or a load of black, then it reduces the file size. But that doesn't have the lossy compression, the sort of mosquito noise you get around things on JPEG. So we prefer that. The other thing is, if you're scanning a negative, there's more dynamic range in the negative visually than you can get in normal dynamic range pictures. So we'll scan that using special equipment. We've got some nice scanners that really scan all of the dynamic range, all the resolution on a piece of film. And then we store that in formats that are better designed for storing that sort of content. Where possible, we'll try and get camera raw files, so the effectively digital negatives, what the sensor of the camera actually saw with all the data that described it. And they are definitely better quality, but they are a bit more proprietary. So it's always that balance of do I normalise, do I try and keep everything in one standard, or do I sort of live with the original? The best answer is do both. And that's what we do for documents. So if somebody gives us a Word document to archive, we will archive exactly that document, but we'll also make a PDF. And we trust the PDF will be viewable over time. And the software we use takes a Word document. If you've embedded an Excel sheet, we'll strip that out and store that separately. I mean, to be honest, I struggle to get embedded Excel sheets to work from a Windows machine to a Mac these days. So imagining trying to read that in 100 years is really unlikely. So when we archive things, we'll keep absolutely a bitstream copy, a binary copy of the original, but we'll also try and strip out the goodness of it and keep that off to one side. So digital photos. To be honest, we don't have a good long-term digital archive yet. It's a project we're running at the moment for photos specifically. But that's a relatively solved problem. There's a lot of people in the world with much bigger digital collections than we've got. We're generally we've still got 6 million photos physically, so it's going to take us a while to work through those.
Okay. In terms of the storage that you use, do you use error correction methodology in there as well? So there is, when you get those bad bits, you've got a way of going.
Well, there's always layers of that anyway. So all data tapes and hard drives or anything are covered in Reed-Solomon encoding and error, forward error correction, all these things to try and give you something that's perfect. The stats I showed earlier was what happens beyond that. Okay. So when all of that has done its best, you still, when you've got really large volumes, you'll still see some errors. It's a balance of how much data they waste on all the error correction versus how much data you want on a hard drive. So they've pitched it somewhere, but they haven't generally pitched it to last 100 years, which is where those stats come in. But then we have to overlay on top of that our own checksumming. So really, we do simple MD5 checksums, which are really, the collision possibilities are really unlikely there. You can force a collision, so you get the same MD5 checksum, but they will never really occur in practice. So we make sure that what we've got now is what we knew we had when the content was archived originally.
This is probably for after the session out there. But it just seems to me with this increasing complexity and increasing, and not only in terms of standards, but also in equipment to read and so on, that actually is a reflection on the human condition. So that's possibly for us.
Yes. Yeah. No, life is in all ways becoming more complicated, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, this is like decreasing, increasing entropy. It's weird.
Well, I think we're probably getting to a point now where we're sort of coming to a bit of a natural break. But I think the final question for me, which kind of leads on from what Glenn was saying there, is in your personal life, do you probably take more photos and store more digital stuff than average, or are you somebody who's very, very conservative because you want to archive it correctly? What's your...
Yeah, so I take a lot. I mean, you all take photos on your iPhone and things like that. I generally keep everything. I'm not short of storage these days, so I've got every photo I've taken on my iPhone and every photo I've taken on my still scanners. But you do worry about finding the goodness amongst all of that, which is why, as I said earlier, I'll put a little bit of effort into occasionally forcing myself to pick out selections of that. But I do eat my own dog food, as I talked about at the beginning there, and make sure that I would notice if I lost a file or a file was corrupted. It would be very disappointing to find a very significant photo I thought I had, I suddenly no longer have. So I do that at home, and then I end up worrying about it at work as well.
That's fantastic.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Steve. So, just thank you on behalf of BCS.
Oh, lovely.
Gift for you.
Thank you very much.